Bryan Alexander is our guest interviewee today, and I am Catherine Manley. I have with me Rebecca Ferguson and Kirsty Kitto, and we will be talking with Bryan today about the future of learning analytics. We'd like to ask you who you are and why you think we are talking with you today.
Well, I don't know if I can help you with the second part, but I can help you with the first. My name is Bryan Alexander. I'm a futurist. That means that I help people think more creatively and strategically about the future. My specific focus is the future of higher education. Doing this, I make a lot of media. I write scholarly books. Like here's one, my most recent one over my shoulder. I do a weekly video program. I teach classes at Georgetown University and get into all kinds of trouble. I track about 95 different trend lines, the impacting the future of higher education, and some of them include learning analytics, everything from big data to AI. So that last part may be why you invited me here.
That is, in fact, why we invited you. When you think about education, the education field, and I know in particular you have interest in higher education, but learning analytics crosses both higher ed and K-12. So
Yes.
please feel free to speak to both if you wish. But where do you see education heading in 10 years?
Overall, or focusing on learning analytics?
Overall, where do you see it heading?
Depending on how we do things, higher education in the United States may shrink a bit. That is, we may have overbuilt our academic institutions for the demand that we will actually experience. And that demand may shrink as a result of demographics. It may shrink as a result of changing public attitudes towards higher education. And it may also be the impact of artificial intelligence. In terms of demographics, I mean, it's pretty clear right now that the human race is moving to a position where we have fewer and fewer kids and we live longer and longer lives. A lot of higher education is still aimed at the traditional age 18 to 22-year-old, and that population is shrinking. Now, if the pronatalists like Orban in Hungary and Vance in the U.S. suddenly waved magic wands and women just suddenly just became pregnant tomorrow, that wouldn't have an impact on higher education for 19 years. So I think for the next 10 years, that's one thing we have to bear in mind. The second is changing attitudes. That is, higher education is increasingly unpopular. People are increasingly skeptical of it for a wide range of reasons. Some of them are very political. So in the US, we have the Republican Party and conservatives who think that higher education is a hotbed of fill in the blank, Bolshevism, transgenderism, etc. But also there's a lot of nervousness about student debt. There's a sense that higher education is snooty or looks down at people. And there's a sense that the labor market, higher education might not be the best guide to the labor market. And in terms of AI, it's quite possible that AI will simply make higher education look bad. That as AI improves in quality, that people may feel they can get a better and better experience from AI without having to go into debt. At the same time, since we have zero ability to control cheating in higher education due to AI, that it's possible that people will just start perceiving degrees to be of lower quality. So I think with all of those, I think we're heading to perhaps a shrunken sector. And by shrunken, I mean fewer students, fewer staff and faculty working there, perhaps fewer institutions as well. I don't mean to be so grim and ominous sounding. I think there's a lot more going on, but in terms of the big picture, I think that's there. Now, that's if we do things wrong. If, on the other hand, if we double down on creative work in higher education, if we do more student-centered work, if we take advantage of technologies like, oh, I'll just pick one, learning analytics, if we can improve the higher education experience, then that may improve our reputation and improve our ability to keep going and doing what we're doing. That's
Yeah, so I have a question about that because on the one hand, I mean I think that's definitely a possibility in the Australian context and maybe in the American context, maybe generally. But actually, do you think those attitudes are prevailing globally?
Well, I phrase this pretty precisely to speak to the US, in part because
Yeah,
I'm finishing up a book on the subject right now. But I work globally, and I work with schools everywhere from Scandinavia to Australia to Singapore to Russia. And I think it really varies from country to country. The US really pushed the boundaries on student debt. We're way beyond anybody else. I mean, Britain is starting to do that, but Britain is also starting to experience both a decline in revenue for their institutions, including Russell Group schools, and they're also suffering from
Mm.
decline in enrollment, partly the self-inflicted wound of Brexit. Um, Canada, for example, is now suffering a huge reduction in enrollment because the federal government there decided to drastically reduce international enrollment. Canadian higher education really depended on international enrollment, and so they are looking at program cuts across the country, especially in Ontario. Now, Australia, you guys also depend heavily on international enrollment, especially from Asia, especially from China, and that's going to be problematic, depend on quite a few things, including geopolitics. If Trump heightens Cold War 2.0 and China decides to punish AUKUS nations for participating, we might see fewer students flow that way. Um, but also all these countries, Australia, Britain, all of Europe. I mean, anywhere that has gone through development has gone through the demographic transition. The minute you give a society improved healthcare, improved public health, greater wealth, and especially once you give women more access to education, more access to the labor market, greater control over reproduction, once you do that, childbirth falls off a cliff in almost every single society. I mean, you can find a couple of exceptions. Israel, there are a few communities in the West Bank which are still producing kids. In the United States, there are some very, very conservative people in Utah that are still producing kids at scale. Otherwise, no. Which is why China, for example, is so terrified because because their population is going through this massive transformation right now, which is why they are now no longer the most populous nation on earth. And you can see this happening throughout Scandinavia, definitely in Russia. There's an argument which says that Putin made the huge attack on Ukraine because pretty soon they're just basically going to run out of young people to staff the army at sufficient qualities. I mean, this transition is absolutely huge. But of course, every nation has different politics. The minute we talk about, say, France, the politics are out the window, right? Some countries have very strong national higher education ecosystems. The U.S. has zero. We don't have a national higher education ecosystem. You look at Latin America, you've got the long tradition of both combination of state-funded and Catholic universities. And just as a sideline, in the US, I'm not sure about this globally, but in the US, Catholic universities have been suffering a great deal, primarily because of the double whammy of childhood sex abuse scandals and decreasing religious belief in the United States. So a lot of Catholic universities I've talked to have said that they are instead focusing on social justice, which is part of their tradition, but it's different from saying they're Catholic universities.
So I'd like to bring us to a discussion of data and algorithms and how that, learning analytics is really, reliant on data and algorithms and in terms of trying to improve educational outcomes. So how do you think the use of data and algorithms in education is going to change in the next 10 years?
Well, there are some things that look pretty stable and durable, and some things that look pretty chaotic. Some of the stable and durable things are we're continuing to make more data, most of it born digital. And as we make more and more data, we continue to find more uses for it. So I think that just seems likely to continue. I don't think anything is slowing that down. I mean, where the data lives may move. At some point, we may get sick and tired of the web and follow Apple towards just almost offline applications. But I don't think we'll give up on the internet completely, nor the digital revolution. So I think we'll keep producing data and that data will become ever more finely grained, as well as higher in quantity. We will also keep thinking of ways to slice and dice it to come up with new projections and new models based on that. So I think those are pretty stable. What's a little bit more chaotic is the politics around it. That is, you have a chunk of the population that thinks that data analytics are awesome and can be used for predictive models that can really help improve the world. And opposing them is a chunk which says that data analytics are inhumane, that they are violations of privacy potentially, that they reflect and reproduce biases, and so we should stop that, or we should reboot them. I'm mindful of Kathy O'Neill's really good book with the best title of the 21st century called Weapons of Mass Destruction, where she argues that the original data sets for a lot of big data and data analytics are just too corrupted, not in terms of information science, but in terms of bias, and we should just toss them out and start again. I'm not doing enough justice to her book, but that's a sense of opposition. And in between those two groups in academia, you have a good number of people who either think data analytics are handy or they're kind of useful in avoiding some problems. Now, the bigger chaos agent here is AI, and I don't just mean learning large language models, but I mean the overall picture of AI, because we obviously train AI on large data sets, and we can build quite a bit more. I'm waiting to see what we can do with, say, creating GPTs based on student data that can be used for advising. But this leads us to some really interesting directions. So, do we, for example, have bots that can do the work of a professional data scientist? Will bots come up with more and more ways of slicing and dicing information? And do we then see some really powerful and efficient uses of information? Do we have to deal with some unemployment as a result? Do data scientists shift towards being bot herders and basically trying to mine them for hallucinations and trying to corral them? Um, this all depends on what happens with AI. And AI is very fragile right now. It sounds weird to say that for a business that's, hundreds of billions of dollars. And we just learned this week that Europe is throwing, tens and tens of billions of euros at it, and India is trying to commit to it in a large scale. But I think generative AI in particular faces a series of real problems. One is there's no business model. Generative AI is super expensive. Even if you use DeepSeek, it's not coincidental that DeepSeek was started as a side project by a hedge fund, so they had billions, to spend on this. But Microsoft, Google, as far as I can tell, they're not making money on this. OpenAI is just a running, a bucket with a hole in it, just money pouring out of it. It's not making any fun on this. At some point, the capital investors are going to want to see a return. The second problem is that there's a lot of regulation. Italy banned ChatGPT 3 when it came out, and they just banned DeepSeek this week. You can imagine a lot of legislation looking at things like deepfakes, as well as trying to corral bias issues, as well as trying to control uh, people's use of it. I mean, it's possible that regulation will try and cram that genie back in the bottle, maybe corral it to the extent that we do now with, say, bioengineering. Um, a bigger problem or a more interesting one in the academic world is that AI is very unpopular. I mean, yeah, there's a hype machine, but there's been counter hype since the beginning, and people resist AI. They critique it. I've had people on my program. I'll have one person say everyone should be doing AI right now because it is the future. I've had people say you shouldn't touch it. You shouldn't even try it because AI is so problematic and so dangerous that even trying it is going to contribute to something profoundly unethical. All the people I'm talking to right now about AI use in higher education in the developed world are telling me that they're running into all kinds of challenges of professors saying, I don't want to use this. This is wrong. For, we can talk about all the different criticisms if you like, but they object to it and they want to be able to opt out, or they want to have their students be able to opt out. And that opposition has shown up in some interesting ways. Northwestern University professor has come up with two interesting bits of software, one that will protect your digital content from being scraped by AI, another one that will poison AI scrapers and reduce their quality. Um, I would not be surprised to see this being a kind of not a low-grade civil war, but a great deal of tension. And I think we're seeing an alignment where a lot of progressives in the United States are starting to turn against Silicon Valley and aligning that with their politics, while a lot of Republicans led by Trump and Musk are very pro AI. So we might see this academic issue become very much part of the culture wars. So I think, Catherine, when it comes to thinking about data analytics, AI right now is that real chaos agent.
Like that's actually a really interesting lens that I hadn't actually thought of, because I mean I think especially with Musk going so heavy behind Trump, like that perspective, or that potential for that culture wars thing, I think is quite high. Can you and we've seen how that works. Like it leads to important situations that we need to address as a world, turning into unaddressable things, like climate change, or we've had multiple cases of that now. Can you how would we, as a community that's sort of straddling and trying to use data but quite pragmatic about it, can you that's actually an important thing to try and address now before it happens. Do you have any ideas about how that might be navigated? Or is it something we're just going to have to let ride?
You're right. I think you're right. Some of the interviews I've done have been very fraught. People have been very upset. And I think people are going to dig in on this, especially because again, focusing on the US here. By the way, just step back. I said in the developed world, when I've been talking to people about AI and education in the developing world, they are much more curious about simply how to use it. A former student of mine has been working in sub-Saharan Africa, developing AI programs for K through 12 education, which is really great. I was in Mexico City this past fall, and everyone was just curious about how to use AI. So that kind of the seething debate I'm not seeing happening here as much. Um, I would say that the use of big data in government and in nonprofits as well as in business might be a useful way to point to, just to say, look, it's going to help these operations become more efficient, and that's a good thing. We want to make our enterprises more efficient, um, especially in terms of saving students money. Um, uh, I think also if you can describe the ethical foundations for doing this kind of work, how you're gathering the data, how you're sourcing it, how you're protecting it, who's involved in all the decisions made in data gathering, but also analyzing it. So, do you have good representation from different stakeholders within a university, students, faculty, staff? Do you have good representation politically in terms of identity? Do you have marginalized populations who were involved in this data process? I think that can make a lot of progress. And then ultimately showing positive results. One thing we have in the U.S., including several not too far from Catherine, are community colleges. And over time, community colleges have generated, these are 2-year undergraduate institutions, and they've generated fairly complex curricula that become the complexity of which become a real challenge for students to navigate, especially the students for whom English is not their first language or they are first generation college students. So people have been using generative AI to come up with better curricular paths. It just seems like a win, to help students have a better experience. If you can prove that using data analytics to improve academic advising works, I think that would be a real big win. In terms of mental health advising, I think this is a chance. This is an area for improvement that might be dicier, but those are a few ways I could think of to help soothe the savage debate. I need a better metaphor.
So really demonstrate positives as well as really strategically plan to address
Mhm.
potential negatives. I think that's a nice balance.
I would ask, so what do you think are the biggest challenges facing the field of learning analytics?
It might be difficult to win sufficient resources from within a university or a college to do the work if a university or college is suffering overall financially. So if you're dealing with budget cuts, for example, it's going to be harder to defend, say, a data analyst's job than, depending on the institution, a frontline instructor's job. Again, it's going to depend on culture. Trying to get sufficient funding for data hosting, for running software, for licenses, especially for security is challenging. And we know that a lot of higher education IT suffers from not being able to hire and retain staff simply because we can't pay enough compared to the private sector or even the public sector. And so that can be a real challenge. Um, I think those are a couple of issues. I mean, they're also the host of problems endemic within the field. So things like data standards, trying to get well-formed data, trying to get different silos, to, trying to cross between different silos. I mean, all of those are already established, and those continue to be problems. But I do wonder as well to what extent politics can play a role, again, depending on the nation. So I'm thinking about nations right now which are dealing with ethnic unrest or governments that are putting down ethnicities. So, thinking of Myanmar, thinking of China, thinking of the different tensions in India. Of course, thinking about more problematic countries like where they're already more fraught. Thinking of Iraq, for example. Um, it's possible that you will see political tension spill over into this way. A government or a political activist looking for data about students, faculty, or staff based on some kind of angle. Are you teaching too many students of group X? Do you hire not enough faculty of group Y? So that could play a role as well.
So I'd like to ask you to give both your positive, if everything went really well, and then also your dystopian future kind of vision of where do you see learning analytics in 5 years or 10 years? Let's go with 10 years.
And the climate crisis is going to ratchet up. We're going to see more damages being done, everything from more storms to more fires. I hate to say this to Kirsty, given Australia's terrible experience with fires, but more of the same, along with more flooding, along with more salt water infiltrating fresh water. How does this impact learning analytics? This makes doing higher education's work more difficult. This makes our lives, our community lives, more difficult as a data analyst or a data scientist or an IT professional. So I think that's just right now going to be there in both of these worlds. If, for example, we were to suddenly have a massive wave of climate action, Greta Thunberg takes over the UN, I think it's going to take years for this to turn around. So in the 10-year horizon, I think that's just a stable thing. Dystopia, I'd be really concerned about a few things. I'd be worried about cybercrime, damaging data analytics. So in many, many ways, I'd be worried about persistent problems of standards and compatibility. I'd be very worried about politics, either in the sense of an authoritarian regime using data analytics to make certain purposes happen. Here in the US, one thing that I've been asking every college and university is, what do you do when immigration authorities come to your university and ask you for data about a student or a faculty member or a staff member to deport them? How does your staff respond, or have you planned this out? I can kill conversations apparently in any group. It's a special gift I have. But I think for dystopia, this is something that we have to consider. We also have to consider some of the ways that AI can go badly wrong. So, for example, let's just say we invest a lot in AI, and you're running chatbots and other analytical tools that are doing visualizations and good stuff, and AI basically collapses. We have another AI winter. So you have a lot of investment that's then gone. We also have the possibility of people turning to analytics a lot, but de-emphasizing human interaction. So emphasizing the quantitative and de-emphasizing the qualitative. So that students, faculty, and staff get lost in the cracks, and the experience becomes colder and less humane. That's assuming. So for 10 years, that's about as dystopian as I want to get. In terms of utopian, what I'm really hoping is that we have a greater commitment to a standard of care. And this is something which the US excels at. I mean, we're pretty unusual this way in terms of our attitude towards students. We have an elaborate student life system. We have all kinds of ways of keeping students happy on campus. We've innovated the completely bonkers student athletics industry, right? We've done all this mad stuff. And maybe we can do what Georgetown University referred to as cura personalis, care for the whole student. So the student, we do extra care for students' physical health, but also for their mental health. We give them more support for their academic success. And we also help them in other ways. It might be that they are suffering from food insecurity. It might be they're suffering from climate issues. It might be they're suffering from physical dislocation, and we become more and more of a social services enterprise. In that respect, I think we might see data analytics become more and more powerful. as we try, a president or a chancellor gets to sift through data about their population, trying to identify people who need help, who need assistance in different ways. I was talking to a very unusual college. It's a very rural college to serve poor rural populations. And their president, the communities, asked, what's the biggest challenge keeps you from sending teenagers to college? And what came back was young teenage women getting pregnant and then falling off the academic track. And so they came up with this really interesting idea. They built a special dormitory, residence hall, just for teen mothers. And it was
Mm.
staffed and maintained by other students who had to do this as a work study. And they built a pretty elaborate place. I mean, I don't mean posh. I mean with lots of playgrounds and good things like this. And it really increased the number of students who were coming. It was a really just a wise and good thing to do. So I'm wondering, using data analytics, how many other presidents and chancellors can find those kind of opportunities to really help people. I think overall in 2035, you could look back and say, this is a much better experience for higher education. Higher education is a better, more just, more rewarding place. How's that for optimism?